You don't own me. Don't try to change me in any way. You don't own me. Don't tie me down, 'cause I'll never stay.
O is for ownership, part 2. I sometimes wonder whether what we loosely term feminism is just another distraction orchestrated by men to keep women busy and feeling like they're fighting for something, but actually accomplishing nothing substantive. Case in point, like the song You Don't Own Me, so many of what women consider to be feminist anthems were written or co-written by men. And the message is almost always, I want to keep serving you, but I have limits to the abuse I'll take from you. So I'm going to stamp my feet and get mad, and you'll have to make some empty promises so that I can keep telling myself that men are worth saving. Then things will go back to the way they were for the most part, but at least you don't own me. Well, I'm going to save a discussion of lady empowerment songs for another time, but the bottom line here is that women's publicly aired anger at and frustration with men doesn't mean a damn thing if at the end of the day they still go back to sucking their dicks and accepting minor or temporary concessions, or a few minutes of penile attention as proof of respect or love. The only thing men understand besides violence is denial of service. And very few women are willing to take their anger that far, even though cutting off the gynergy fountain isn't in any way a violent or extreme solution. Men allow certain feminist distractions, such as the pursuit of elusive equality between the sexes, but not liberation. But it is empowering to sing men's words and pretend that they change our lives, I suppose. But anyhow, let's get back to the topic at hand, ownership. It is clear if you live in the world and are a thinking woman that males and females define ownership, and many other concepts for that matter, differently. But it is always men's definitions that matter, even if they are irrelevant or even harmful to women. Men define how we live, what we're allowed to have access to, what we think and say and do, and as I mentioned above, they even orchestrate our socio-political beliefs and movements. Many women end up going along to get along because it's easier, less dangerous, and more profitable. Those who dare to define their parameters, or even to just question the male paradigm, end up being outcasts and worse. So, as a result, we still don't fully understand what ownership means to women, just as we don't understand female sexuality, female abilities, or female psychology. So, in various senses of the word, men own women's realities. I did a cursory look for any research on sex differences in the understanding of ownership, and I found one. It was authored by a man, of course, and it hails from Canada and dates back to 1994. So obviously, this is a hot topic. Without going into a lot of detail, I'll summarize Dude's findings with the following examples of typical male and female thinking on ownership. Male. That shit is mine and mine alone. If you touch it, there will be repercussions because you're violating my right as a man to have this shit. Female. In owning this shit, I feel a sense of responsibility, pride, and connectedness with myself, others, and the world. And it may be no surprise to you, and we see this in tons of psychological research on sex differences on a whole range of issues, that men are, generally speaking, simplistic, black and white, self-centered, entitled thinkers. Women, on the other hand, are deeper, more complex, and nuanced thinkers. I can't help but be reminded yet again of how male neglect and dismissal of women's thinking and psychology has likely held back the development of societies around the world throughout history and has hastened the destruction of the planet. If this conclusion pisses you off, please note that I'm not saying anything new here, although perhaps more bluntly than you're used to. Men demonstrate how they operate every single day, and their thinking is present in how every single society is structured and operates. Whether on a personal, local, or national level, ownership in the eyes and minds of men is an exclusive right to enjoy, use, or abuse that which one claims as one's own at will, and to use force to defend it. Ownership is a vast topic, and I'd love to teach a college-level course on it. Some of the subtopics would include the history of marriage, the slavery of women, and the concept of the body as property and a product to be owned, rented, marketed, and traded. We could explore the limits of female ownership, especially the interesting contradiction mothers often post in asserting ownership of their children without interference from the government or the public, yet expecting society to foot the bills associated with this privilege. And then we could explore other forms of human ownership, that of group slavery throughout history, which stems from male ownership of females, although the latter is generally not acknowledged as ownership for very obvious reasons. We could also talk about ownership in a political sense, from the point of view of capitalism and consumerism, libertarianism, anarchism, socialism, and communism, and how poverty and some element of ownership are major issues in each of those systems. There is also the geopolitical issue of country formation and border defense. The only reason we have countries is because of men's need to own everything under the sun, and war is a direct result of men's need to own land, culture, and people. We could then get into more modern ethical issues of patents and copyright, and whether anyone has the right to own and control water sources or plant life, or ideas or words, and there is so much more. I think it would be a fascinating multidisciplinary course, but I don't think it would be allowed these days, especially if taught by a woman. Now, I can't address all of that here in this post, although some topics may appear later in the alphabet series, but I'll talk briefly about a few issues surrounding property ownership. I remember when I was 17, my mother was studying to become a real estate agent, which was kind of funny because she'd never worked hard for anything in her life, including in her career as a mother and housewife, and she had no clue how much time agents had to put into the job if they wanted to build a profitable career. Needless to say, that job never panned out for her, but she was fine, even following divorce. She did what works for many women. She was supported through alimony and child support that didn't go to supporting children, and then went on the prowl for a wealthy man. She eventually found one, and luckily he died after a few years and left her a pile of money. If you have a lazy nature and can stomach being a man's whore, this is the best and easiest route to surviving as a woman in this world. Be offended if you wish, but I'm stating a blunt truth about how this world works. So one day, I was sitting outside the back of the family home with my mother and father, who was still living with us, and Mother said to me, "Here's what you should do. You should buy a house and rent out the rooms to pay the mortgage." Basically an investment strategy that is much more common now than it was in the 1980s. I remember looking at her, and I didn't have a response. Well, I had learned not to have a response to anything she said because she was a clinical narcissist, and any questioning or disagreement could lead to punishment and other insanity. But over the years, and still remembering that nugget of ignorant wisdom imparted to me, I have a response. First, I'd never qualify for a mortgage in Canada. Never have, never will. It's difficult if you're not a conventional person with a stable and high income. Second, despite my parents buying their first home only because their parents gave them money to afford it, I know my parents would never have helped me, and I was cut out of all family inheritances by my mother when I was 20. Third, I don't believe in buying things that I can't pay for outright. Debt is akin to imprisonment, in my opinion. I've been dirt poor, but I've never been in debt. And finally, over the years, I've come to agree with anarchist and communist thinking that landlords are a scourge. And as I see more of the world and note how fucked up life is becoming for poor people in so-called privileged countries such as my own, these beliefs have become firmer. I have no problem whatsoever with private property ownership, which I'll mention a little bit below, but I have very specific ideas about how money should be earned, what should never be an income source, and the necessity for safe, affordable housing for all people. No woman is safe. Owning property and having money helps and gives you options, which can be the difference between life and death in some cases, but it doesn't guarantee safety or freedom from men. Ownership is the domain of men. It is the basis of their hierarchy of power. The more they own, the more power they have. Women don't exist on the same hierarchy. We're not allowed to own much, including our own bodies, although to some extent women can own the children they produce. We are more likely to own property and things through orbiting males or gaining family help, including inheritance, but it doesn't help us escape our sexual subordination in the world. And I talk more about this in my post M is for Mother. See the link below. Further, when you orbit a male, you, and by extension everything you own, is owned by him. This is the history of the world. Once upon a time, a man could rape you and own you. In some cultures, you would be dirtied and have no choice but to marry him. In other cultures, and this is still happening today in places such as Kyrgyzstan and rural China, a man can abduct a woman or girl, rape her, and own her because she has no escape. In many cultures, once the rape or abduction and marry scheme fell out of fashion, families mostly just resorted to selling their daughters to men. Sometimes complete strangers to the girl, sometimes distant family members or friends of the family. And different cultures had different names and practices for this financial transaction. And any property or belongings women brought to the marriage became the property of the husband. The best part of this change of ownership is that it has been sold as a female invention and has often been described as a scheme to trap men. And throughout history, it has been bolstered by denying women access to education and the job market and leaving them dependent on marriage for survival. Cultures have evolved fairy tales and other propaganda that are fed to little girls to romanticize being swept away by Prince Charming and to see their wedding day as the best day of their life. Over time, brides themselves have become the ones to plan their own slavery, to pour energy into organizing their wedding event, with males wasting no energy at all in an institution that was designed by them for them. And even today, the wedding industrial complex is one of the most profitable patriarchal inventions on the planet. And women, despite being allowed to participate in society and achieve financial freedom now, still choose to be owned. Every married woman that I know, and there aren't many anymore, is smart and capable, except when it comes to her marriage or partnership. The men own their attention, energy, and time, and it amazes me when an otherwise independent female friend will turn down or cancel a plan with me because she's afraid of being punished by her male partner for denying him attention. Slavery exists, and it's called heterosexuality, in my experience. Getting back to property ownership, there are all sorts of facts and figures out there about how much of the world's property women actually own. It gets confusing because surveys don't measure how women get property. I'd bet that most of the time women gain land through orbiting men. They either co-own, have the property put in their name, or they win it in a divorce, buy it with the money won in divorce proceedings, or their owner dies and they inherit land. Women may also inherit property from family or get help from family in making a purchase. What we do know is that never married single women are the least likely to own property, and they're the only group of women with a sex gap in percentage of ownership compared to men. Married, divorced, and widowed women in the U.S., for example, have closed the gap in property ownership in the last 30 years. When you don't orbit cock, you still don't earn as much as men and don't benefit from a male salary. Sorry, single women. It's interesting to look at property ownership internationally. Contrary to what many people think and the stereotypes they may have, property ownership isn't more common in wealthier countries. Almost none of the countries with 80% plus home ownership is a wealthy country. If you look at the ratio of owner-occupied units to total residential units, you see a reflection of the combination of government policy, property prices, ease in getting mortgages, level of interest rates, and societal mentality on home buying. Laos and Romania have about 96% home ownership. They are not rich countries. 90% of Cubans and Chinese own their own dwelling. Canada and the US, on the other hand, sit at about 66%, and just over half of Japanese homes are owned. And speaking for my own country, up to 6% of our homes are owned by foreign investors currently, and this has likely had a negative effect on lower income, local potential home buyers. And I know that many younger people in Canada can't even wrap their heads around the idea of trying to buy property. Myself, I remember working for a short, agonizing spell in a private kindergarten in China, catering to rich people, and I met one Chinese mother who told me that she'd just bought a house in one of Canada's most expensive cities over the internet. She'd never even been to Canada before. And the last time I was in Canada, I was renting a room in a house that was put up for sale. Chinese real estate agents were coming through the house and doing a video tour with foreign buyers. Canada recently implemented a foreign buyer ban, which has been extended to 2027, but I think the damage to the housing market has already been done. And whether foreign or local, unlike in the past, landlords these days believe that renters exist to pay mortgages and should absorb the costs of interest hikes. Very shameful. Conclusion. You already know what I think about marriage and that I have a real problem with child ownership as well. And there really is no solution to freeing women as a class if most are content with complaining about male dominance in their relationships, yet are still continuing to support them in all possible ways. Women could change the structure of the world if they stopped supporting traditional male ownership models, such as promoted in heterosexual lifestyles. It's pretty simple, actually. The housing and property ownership issue is probably equally unsolvable as long as people support capitalism and believe in earning money for doing nothing. Housing is one of those basic needs like food, basic health care, and safety that shouldn't be something people struggle to achieve. And when I say housing, I mean safe, quality housing, not the warehousing concept that became a problem under some communist regimes, or that currently happens among the very poor in Western countries, and especially in places like Hong Kong, where too many people are forced to share an inadequate space despite being strangers. I also think women should be able to access housing complexes, neighborhoods, and even entire towns where they can live free of men in safe, clean housing. I'd love to see what I touched on in my post, I want my own Vatican City, a country of women and girls for women and girls, but without the religion.